Draco Malfoy and the Truth of the Heart by Draco will hear about this. Chapter 25, Bitter Truths. "I'm sorry, Mr. Malfoy," Heather Jones sighed, "but I can't discuss what your fiancé wanted to see me about when he called me up for an emergency session. I am bound by patient-healer confidentiality. I won't discuss anything you tell me with him, and the other way around, unless the two of you specifically allow me to do so." "I know what he came to see you about," Draco muttered. I feel horrible about it." "And why is that?" "I didn't mean to upset him," Draco whispered. "I didn't expect anything I said to have that effect." "You're not the only one who worries about your relationship, Mr. Malfoy," she told him with a sad smile. "In fact, Mr. Potter keeps pushing me for a joint session with you. He's desperate to know what's really on your mind. I keep telling him the two of you are not ready," she sighed. "But on the other hand, I fear that if we don't do it soon, the danger of you starting a conversation without me in the room might be a more serious worry to factor in." She sighed again, meeting his eyes. "I want to hear your opinion, Mr. Malfoy. Do you think you could answer some of Mr. Potter's questions about both your condition and your relationship with me in the room to help rein in his anxieties?" Draco frowned. "What kind of questions?" he asked. "I'm not going to lie," she sighed. "He will want to know how you feel about him, most likely." "That's going to be problematic, isn't it?" Draco winced. "He won't want to hear what I have to say." "No, he won't like your answer," Heather Jones agreed. "But he really wants to hear it because he has suspicions of his own. And let me tell you, what's going on in his mind is hurting him more than anything you can say ever will. Yes, it will hurt him, no doubt. It will be incredibly hard to hear. But he wants to understand, and maybe you should give him the chance to do it." "Are you sure?" Draco asked, feeling sick to the stomach at the prospect of discussing the sinkhole that are his emotions with Harry. "Fear can be a beast, Mr. Malfoy," she said. "It can grow and tear you apart from the inside. I think you, too, are well acquainted with it. That's what's happening to your fiancé right now. The best thing you can do for him is to be as honest as you can." Draco nodded hesitantly. He still felt horrified at the imagination of revealing to Harry what he'd been discussing with Heather Jones, but if that's what Harry needed, maybe he could try to give him a little insight. No one had said this therapy thing was going to be easy, after all. "Remember, you decide what's too much," she reminded him. "If you don't want to discuss something, or you want to break the joint session off, you can say so anytime. But I think it would be good for Mr. Potter to show some goodwill and give it a try." "Okay," Draco nodded. "Good," Heather Jones said. "I'll tell him. And don't worry, I'll be there every step along the way, and I'll cut in when I think it's going to escalate." "Thank you," he sighed. "Not for that," she smiled. "So let's go back to your assignment, Mr. Malfoy. How many things did you put on your list?" Draco sighed, drawing out a parchment from his pocket. "I had real trouble thinking of anything, to be honest," Draco admitted. "Okay." Heather Jones nodded. She did not seem surprised. "Please tell me what you got." Draco bit his lip. He felt strangely squirmish, and his heart was pounding in his ears. 10 things you like about yourself, Mr. Malfoy," Heather Jones said in a playful voice that resembled that of a Quidditch commentator. It broke the tension a bit. "Go!" "Well," Draco sighed, "I think I'm intelligent." "More than intelligent, from what I hear," she agreed. "That's something you are allowed to be proud of." "It doesn't always do me much good, though," he muttered, frowning. "What do you mean by that?" she asked. "There are so many situations where my emotions seem to eclipse my brain." He shrugged. "I try to act rationally, and then I don't. What good does it do to be intelligent if you don't act on it?" "You're human, Mr. Malfoy," she smiled. "This happens to all of us. We make mistakes, even if we should know better, and then we learn from them. It's how we mature. This is nothing you should feel ashamed of, though. There are older and wiser wizards who make mistakes on a daily basis. Look at your parents or other adult role models in your life. Are any of them infallible?" "No," Draco admitted. "What about people in your life that you consider intelligent? Are they acting completely rational 24/7? No, Draco repeated. Then why do you hold such expectations upon yourself? She asked. Draco didn't answer. After a moment he murmured, That was my role, though, in our group. If I wanted to get my Gryffindor friends to listen to me, my logic needed to be perfect. Ah, she nodded. So that's where this is coming from. You've mentioned before that you've been feeling like an outsider among them. Have there been a lot of situations where you felt unheard? Yes, Draco admitted. Have you ever told them? Yes. What did they say? They made excuses. Said that of course they cared about my opinion, but in this situation, it just didn't make sense to do things my way. But that's how it always went, and in the end I was always right. That must have been very frustrating for you, she observed. Draco just nodded. The fact that you turned out to be correct, though, should give you confidence, Mr. Malfoy. You are intelligent, and you are good at solving problems, even if your friends don't always appreciate it. It's a bit hard for me to take pride in anything at the moment, he admitted. I can see that, she nodded. There was a moment of silence between them before she asked, What is next on your list, Mr. Malfoy? I had real trouble finding more, Draco muttered, not looking at her. Other things must have occurred to you, she frowned. Well, he shrugged. People say I'm loyal. Do you agree with that assessment? No, Draco shook his head. I think I'm selfish. Why would you think that? Because all my loyal actions are motivated by selfish reasons. I want to keep the people I love around. I want them to love me. I want them to see me as a good person. That's not real loyalty, it's self-serving. Healer Jones hummed, her brow furrowed. Then she said, From what you're saying, it rather sounds like you're battling with a fear of loss, which makes sense, since you seem to have such a low opinion of yourself. But treasuring the people you love and working on your relationship with them, yes, in a way that will always be self-serving, Mr. Malfoy. Taking care of ourselves means taking care of our relationships and interacting with people we love. But it's not self-serving in a way that makes you a bad person. And I think your loyalty probably goes way beyond this level. You are a loving and caring friend, partner, and family member. That isn't self-serving in any way. You are just perceiving it that way. So what you're saying is my self-perception is screwed up? He frowned, highly skeptical. Of course it is, Mr. Malfoy. She smiled. You wouldn't be here if it wasn't. Your self-esteem is dangerously low. That's why we're doing this exercise. Well, obviously I can't even do that, Draco muttered, frustrated. You told me to find 10 things, and I barely got 3, and I don't believe in any of them. That's what we're here for, she told him, her voice gentle now, to help you along and to work through this. After Draco had taken a couple of deep breaths, she asked, What is your last point on the list? The fact that Harry loves me, he whispered, though half the time I'm not sure I believe that. But you want to believe it, she smiled, because if Mr. Potter loves you, it proves you're worth being loved. Am I correct? Draco didn't answer, but his eyes stung, proving her correct. Mr. Malfoy, I'm sure we can find other things that have nothing to do with Mr. Potter, she continued. Tell me about Quidditch. From what I hear, you are a talented flyer and a great seeker. Draco blinked, taken off guard. Oh, he muttered. Yes, he nodded. I guess. You are incredibly well versed in the field of alchemy, even though you never took a class in the subject, she continued. How do you know that? Draco asked, taken off guard. I asked Mr. Potter the same question I asked you. She smiled. He came up with quite a few more points on the spot. Draco stared at her. His heart was drumming loudly in his ears. You also have a cutting wit, it appears. She smiled. And are a top student. You are a good dueler and fighter. I'm passable, Draco muttered. Nothing compared to Harry. You survived the war, Mr. Malfoy, she reminded him. You made it through the final battle unscathed, and you seem to have saved various people along the way. You are skilled. Draco gulped but didn't answer. And last but not least, she added, You seem to have become some sort of role model for your housemates at Hogwarts throughout the wall.
I never intended that, Draco pointed out. I never did anything special.
Of course you didn't intend it, she agreed. But you did something very special, or it wouldn't have happened.
Draco looked away. Something heavy was pressing onto his chest. All these words felt so wrong for him, like robes that didn't fit and were forced onto him.
And that makes 10, she concluded. So, looking at it, you are a remarkable young man, Mr. Malfoy. You just can't take pride in who you are and what you've done.
I'm not that great. Draco shook his head, his throat tight.
I disagree, she breathed. Mr. Potter disagrees.
Maybe it's your perception of me that's wrong, Draco countered.
So everyone is wrong but you, she smiled. Does that sound likely, Mr. Malfoy?
It does to me, Draco whispered.
Maybe you should consider that other people have a different perception of you, Healer Jones suggested. They can see you in a way that you aren't able to at the moment. That doesn't make them wrong, though. Maybe they just have a better view because they're looking from a different angle. Give their opinions a chance.
But shouldn't I know myself best? Draco argued. None of them know all my darkest thoughts and secrets. They can't know how messed up I really am.
Your mind, though, can't always be trusted, Mr. Malfoy, she reminded him. It's a trickster, and a depressed mind is even more vicious in its deception.
Draco didn't answer, trying to process her words. Healer Jones noted something under her board.
I think this is enough for today, she said. Mr. Malfoy, is Mr. Potter going to be at home when you get there now?
I think so, Draco frowned.
Good, she smiled. I feel better knowing you aren't alone in the house this afternoon. I know this was upsetting to you.
Why are we doing it then? Draco couldn't help but ask. Isn't this supposed to help me?
The mind doesn't heal easily, Mr. Malfoy.
She looked at him sadly.
Sometimes we have to speak about things that upset you or make you sad before you can move past them. Letting them rest and suppressing them is what's causing your depression. Talking about them allows you to heal, even if it's hard.
Draco sighed and nodded. So that's why we're doing this thing with Harry next week, too? He checked.
Exactly. She nodded. For him, some things need to be clarified before he can work through them. Maybe you can use this week to think about what you would like to share with him.
Okay, Draco nodded.
Thank you for today, she smiled, getting up to shake Draco's hand. I'll see both of you next week, then.
Throughout the week, Harry and Draco didn't talk about the shared therapy session they had ahead of them. The rumpet in the room was politely ignored, but when they went to bed at night, Harry would initiate passionate sex that got a tad more intense, if not desperate, each time. Harry would hold Draco just that bit tighter, kiss him just that bit harder, and Draco knew it meant that he was nervous, but he couldn't find words to reassure him. He still couldn't picture anything he could say in this session that wouldn't hurt Harry. So he just kissed him back and clung to him as Harry thrust into him, communicating without words, hoping it was enough. When the time for their session with Healer Jones came, Harry had become a fidgety mess, while Draco felt strangely detached. The calm before the storm, maybe?
Thank you both for being here today.
Healer Jones smiled at them as they sat in her office, Draco on his usual armchair and Harry on the love seat. Draco could feel Harry glancing at him. He wondered if he should have sat with Harry, but he felt like this much proximity would have overwhelmed him in this setting.
And thank you, Mr. Malfoy, for agreeing to this session in the first place. I know this isn't easy for you.
Draco nodded in acknowledgement. Harry's eyes were burning holes into the side of his face.
Mr. Potter, maybe you could start by telling us why you wanted this shared session with your fiancé to begin with. I gave him a bit of a heads up, but I think it would be good for him to hear it from your lips.
Draco finally forced himself to look over at Harry. Harry's gaze had switched to his hands. His fingers were intertwined in his lap, probably to keep them still. Draco realized how small and insecure he looked. Vulnerable, even. It was a strange look on Harry. Healer Jones and we've been talking a lot about my fear of loss. Harry breathed out at last. You already know some of it.
You experienced it through the war. I kept trying to push you away because I was afraid I'd lose you. I stopped doing that because I realized that it was counterproductive, but the fear never really stopped, Draco, and with everything that's going on at the moment, I am terrified that you're going to leave me.
Why would I leave you? Draco asked, blinking in surprise.
I know things have been difficult with us.
Harry muttered, glancing up at him.
Since the final battle, things haven't been the same. And I know part of it is due to your condition, but I can't help but think that maybe it's because of me. That you stopped loving me. That when I walked into that forest that night, I lost you.
His voice cracked, but he pushed on.
And another part of me is terrified that you're going to get worse and you'll end up hurting yourself like you did when you were under the influence of the Horcrux, and I'll lose you like that. And it's all driving me insane, Draco. I'm trying so hard to keep it together all the time, but when I think about losing you, I feel like I can't breathe. I need you to talk to me. I can't stand it anymore.
Draco gulped, letting all of that sink in. He'd had no idea that Harry was struggling this much, if he was being quite honest. He'd known he'd been running his mind, but that he'd been hiding all this from Draco was a lot to swallow.
Please say something,
Harry breathed. I'm not going to leave you. Draco shook his head. And I'm not going to hurt myself. I know that thing with the Horcrux really scared you, but it was just the Horcrux. I won't do it again. Mr. Malfoy, Healer Jones said gently, I think we all have to accept that the Horcrux drew out something inside of you that was already there. I believe you when you said that you don't have any inclination to commit suicide at the moment, but I think you could be pushed to that edge under the right or wrong circumstances. So Mr. Potter's fear might seem a bit far off to you right now, but it is justified in my professional opinion.
Draco didn't know how to answer. He just frowned at her. She was already turning toward Harry, though.
I think what we can take away at this point, though, she smiled at Harry encouragingly, is that your fiancé has no inclination of hurting himself, and if he keeps up treatment, and if you keep the circumstances at home stable and supportive, there should be no reason for that to change.
Harry blinked and nodded. He was taking deep breaths and gnawing on his lip. His knuckles were white. He was grasping his fingers so tightly. And I never stopped loving you, Draco breathed, making Harry look up at him again. I don't think I'm capable of that.
Sometimes it feels like we're broken,
Harry murmured, and his eyes were bleeding with him now.
Some days you won't even look at me, and now you want to go back to Hogwarts without me.
He gulped, and Harry could see the tears hanging on his eyelids.
You never wanted space from me before,
Harry breathed.
Now it feels like you can't get enough.
Draco's eyes caught onto a tiny thread sticking out of the carpet and stayed there. He only looked up when Healer Jones said his name.
Mr. Malfoy, she said very gently. I think Mr. Potter needs to hear about what you've been telling me. The doubts you were having ever since the final battle.
No! Draco shook his head, his jaw clenching.
He wants to understand, Mr. Malfoy, she breathed.
It won't make anything better, Draco argued.
Draco,
Harry pleaded, making Draco meet his eyes.
Please,
he breathed.
Talk to me. Whatever's going on, I need to know. We can work it out, okay? If I'm doing something wrong, I can be better. I want to be better. And so please, let's just figure this out.
Draco shook his head. This isn't something you can fix, Harry, Draco pointed out.
You won't know until you let me try,
Harry argued, stubborn as ever.
Please, Draco, trust me. I'll never stop fighting for us.
Something about Harry's words hit Draco in a weak spot. He inhaled sharply, holding the air in for a long time before exhaling slowly. He caught Healer Jones's eyes, who smiled encouragingly and nodded. Finally he spoke. You asked if you lost me that night you walked into that forest, Draco asked without looking at him. And you didn't, not in the way you think. I haven't stopped loving you. But when you left me behind, I think something inside of me broke, Harry. Draco glanced over at Harry. He'd raised one hand to his face, covering his mouth and hiding half of his face from Draco's view.
His eyes, though, were resigned and screaming in pain, as if Draco was giving him an answer he had known was coming. He nodded, signaling for Draco to continue. "I know it's not fair of me," Draco amended. "Rationally, I know why you did it, but I can't help but feel like you chose the world over me. Does that make sense? And I can't relate because I know if it had been me, I'd always have chosen you. And maybe that makes me a bad person, but what it comes down to is that it made me feel like I love you more than you love me. Which, thinking back on our years together, isn't exactly a revelation. But before the final battle, I had deluded myself that maybe things had changed, but..." He shook his head, still not looking at Harry. "This probably doesn't make any sense to you, but it felt like the culmination of a lot of things. 4th year? Cho Chang!" There was a choke sound from Harry, and finally Draco looked over to his side, freezing at what he saw. Harry was openly crying. He was trembling violently, and tears were streaming down his cheeks. When Draco's eyes fell into him, he jumped to his feet, fleeing for the door, but Healer Jones stopped him by bolting the door with a spell. Instead, she opened a door at her back, gesturing for Harry to take this one rather than the one leading to the waiting area. "Please, into my office, Mr. Potter," she said. "I'd rather you calmed down in private." Without a word, Harry fled the room, and Healer Jones glanced at Draco, who was still sitting in his armchair, completely stunned. "Please wait here for a moment," she instructed. "I'll be back." Then she followed Harry, closing the door behind herself. In the long minutes that followed their absence, Draco repeated his words and Harry's reaction over and over in his head. He'd expected Harry to argue with him, but he hadn't expected this. When the door finally opened again, Harry returned with Healer Jones, much to Draco's relief. His eyes were red-rimmed and still swimming with tears, but he seemed a bit more collected. "Are you okay?" Draco asked anxiously before he could stop himself. Harry caught Draco's eyes.
"No,"
he breathed out, shaking his head. He crossed the room towards Draco, much to his surprise, and kneeled in front of him, resting his hands on Draco's knees.
"I have something to say to you,"
he said.
"Can you let me speak without interrupting?"
"Okay," Draco nodded.
"I'm sorry,"
Harry breathed, and he blinked hard against the tears.
"I'm so sorry for making you feel that way. You're so far off that you're practically in another universe with your assumptions, and I wished I could find a way to prove this to you. I know that it's my fault. I wished I could go back in time and do things differently. I wished I had realized my feelings for you sooner. Then everything would have been different if I had just..."
"Mr. Potter," Healer Jones injected gently, "blaming yourself isn't productive. Please remember that." Harry let out a sob and nodded.
"Right,"
he said, and more tears escaped his eyelids.
"It's just..."
He blinked against the tears and looked up at Draco with a helpless, broken expression that struck Draco speechless.
"I tried so hard to protect you all these years, and it never occurred to me that I'd be the one hurting you the most. And now I don't know what to do. I want to punch myself. Draco."
Harry pressed his face into Draco's thighs, and Draco stared as he cried into the fabric of his trousers, feeling helpless. He needed to say something. Comforting Harry was what he did. But what did you say when the love of your life was crying because he'd hurt you? Before Draco could come to a decision, Harry straightened up again, taking deep breaths and meeting Draco's eyes. He reached out for one of Draco's hands and kissed it.
"I'm so sorry,"
he repeated.
"I know I have somewhat of a tunnel vision. I am talking to Healer Jones about it, and she thinks it's partly due to the way I grew up. The Dursleys, you know what they were like. And apparently it's not uncommon for teens and adults that have been abused as children to develop a narrower field of vision in a way compared to others. I tend to hyper-focus on what's directly in front of me and miss things that are happening on the side. I think you've become a victim of that more than once, and I'm sorry. I'll try to be better, but that doesn't mean I don't love you. It didn't mean that all those years ago, and it doesn't mean that now. I'm just wired differently. Do you think you can understand that?
Draco stared at him for a long moment, trying to process that. It felt like his brain was trying to put the puzzle pieces together, but he wasn't quite there yet.
You mean the Dursleys? Draco whispered. Because they were violent towards you?
Sometimes.
Harry nodded. Experiences like these influence a person into adulthood, Mr. Malfoy, Heather Jones interjected. And Mr. Potter never had the chance to work through his past. Patterns that developed in his childhood stuck through later stages and never quite left him. He isn't oblivious or blind, as he used to describe it when we first started talking. He simply perceives the world differently, in a way that has been influenced by a childhood laced with violence and, let's be honest, a teenage life that continued to be dangerous, at the least. Mr. Potter will always have a sharp instinct for danger, for instance. Other instincts, especially on the interpersonal level, might be less developed though, but we can work on that.
I never thought of that, Draco admitted, guilt settling in his stomach. I'm sorry.
Don't apologize.
Harry shook his head, squeezing his hand and kissing it again.
I didn't know it was happening either. I would have stopped it if I had. I never wanted to make you feel like you weren't important to me.
He blinked, and then he breathed.
Draco, that night, I know you might have found another solution. I know you might have reacted differently, but please believe me when I say my decision to go and face off against Voldemort alone doesn't mean that I love you any less. I left you behind because I love you, not the other way around.
Draco looked at Harry at the way tears still hung on his eyelids, cheeks wet, nose running. Draco had never seen him like that. Draco knew logically that all this pointed to him being sincere. The ugly self-loathing part in him, though, told him there was no way that Harry could love him the way Draco loved Harry.
I want to believe you,
Draco breathed.
But I'm not sure I do.
Fresh tears rolled from Harry's eyes. It broke Draco's heart how shattered he looked. He regretted the words immediately. You have to accept that, Mr. Potter, Heather Jones said softly. Draco is struggling with extremely low self-esteem. You can't force him to accept the fact that you love him, but that he wants to believe it is a good sign.
Is it my fault,
Harry asked brokenly,
that you don't like yourself?
No, Mr. Potter, Heather Jones injected sternly. What did we say about blaming ourselves for every wrong in the world? Draco's issues are influenced by a lot of things. You might play into them in part, but you are never the solitary factor. Do you understand me?
Harry blinked and nodded. Yes,
he breathed. Then he looked up at Draco again, whispering,
It kills me that you don't seem to love yourself. I can't understand why or how it happened, but please let me tell you that you, Draco Malfoy, are amazing and worth loving. You are caring and kind, and so much more that we need 2 more sessions until I was done telling you about them. I know you don't believe me now, but I'll stay by your side, and I'll love you and show you every day until you believe me. Is that okay?
Draco blinked, his throat tightening.
Yes, he whispered. Of course.
Harry brought his hand to his lips to kiss it again, lingering this time. Finally, Heather Jones spoke. I'd like to end this session for today, she said. This was exhausting for both of you, but I think you took away a lot. Mr. Potter, I'd like to speak to you alone before you leave. Draco, is there anyone you could visit while I speak to your fiancé? Family members? Close friends? I'd feel uncomfortable knowing you were home alone after such a session.
I could go visit Remus, Draco nodded. He should be at home with the baby.
Good, she nodded. Mr. Potter, you can join him when we're done. Harry nodded, getting to his feet and allowing Draco to stand as well. He pulled Draco into a short embrace before he left. Harry was still trembling, Draco realized. Remus was indeed home when Draco arrived. He smiled warmly at Draco as he walked in through their backyard, Teddy's hair changing from blue to blonde in his father's arms. At the sight of Draco, it made Draco smile.
Hello,
Remus smiled.
Aren't you a nice surprise?
Sorry to burst in unannounced, Draco said. Harry and I had a session with a mind healer, and Harry is still there. The healer didn't want me to go home alone because it was a bit intense. Is it okay if I wait for him here?
Of course, Remus nodded, his face sympathetic. Sit, I'll make you some cocoa.
It's hot outside, Remus.
Draco rolled his eyes, but Remus didn't let that deter him.
He simply dropped Teddy into his arms and went to fetch the milk.
I didn't say hot cocoa, Remus chuckled. Chocolate is good against bad thoughts. Didn't you learn anything from my classes?
Right, Draco chuckled, turning his face when Teddy squealed and giggled before planting a tiny right fist against the corner of his lips. Ah! Hi, Teddy! Miss you too.
That boy adores you, you know.
Remus smiled fondly. He can probably smell weakness, Draco snorted,
since I have no idea what to do with him. He does,
Remus allowed with a grin.
But that isn't why he likes you.
Draco was kept from answering when Teddy grabbed his hair and knotted his tiny fingers into it.
Harry joined them around 40 minutes later, entering the kitchen together with Dora, who came back from work.
Oh, look at you, Tedster,
Dora grinned.
torturing your favorite uncle. Good boy.
Save me, Draco pleaded, and his cousin cackled but lifted her son from his arms. Draco stood to splash his face with water, cleaning his godson's spit from his skin. Then he turned to Harry, who was watching him with a soft smile on his face. His eyes were still a bit red, but else he looked quite composed if a bit tired.
Are you okay?
Draco asked him quietly. Harry nodded. He walked up to wrap his arms around him, resting his chin on Draco's shoulder. Draco leaned his chin against Harry's temple.
Are you two staying for dinner?
Dora asked. Draco pulled away to look at Harry and askance.
I think we better go,
Harry said loud enough for them to hear.
I'd like some peace and quiet tonight.
Okay, Remus smiled at them. But come over whenever you want. We like having you around.
Thank you.
Harry smiled at them. They spent the night in quiet companionship, cooking and then eating, curled up on the sofa, watching something on that horrible Michael box. When they went to bed that night, Harry held Draco tightly against him.
I love you,
he whispered into the skin of his neck. I love you too, Draco whispered back. Harry buried his nose into Draco's hair and inhaled deeply.